Evening all. Well, a little bit of explanation as to what's going on tonight. There's a cat crawling around in the background. She's pawing at things. So that's what you might hear in the background from time to time. This is not the same cat that was in the Ban This video. It's the other one. She got jealous of her sister, who became an internet star briefly. I've got a towel drying up in the background, and I've got my left foot in a bowl of hot water, which has got a tablet of potassium permanganate dissolving in it. Why? Well, that's just how I roll. So tonight I want to talk about narrative and the news, and this is a warning. You'll hear this a lot in the news. Reporters love saying the narrative of events, the narrative of Brexit, the narrative of Trump's election, the narrative of the rise of popularism. Okay, anybody uses narrative in context with news, history, and current affairs is a charlatan, and you should mistrust them. And I will explain why. Okay, a bit of background. So many moons ago, I read history at university, and I had to write a lot of essays, had to do a lot of research, had to write a lot of essays. And then after I graduated, I went to film school. And there I learnt how to, amongst other things, I learnt script writing. And I learned how to structure a script, how to tell a story. Now, the disciplines of writing a script and a fiction story and writing historical essays are very different. In some ways, you can overlap. You can borrow techniques from one, apply them to the other. But basically, they're very different. So when I was writing essays for my history degree, and when I write historical articles, what I do is I have to do all these research. I might have a theory in advance. I might sort of say something like the Duke of Wellington's career can be compared to the career of the Roman consul and general Gaius Marius, and I can sort of look at all the information and kind of put forward that theory and back it up with a lot of historical evidence. Now, every so often you come across historical evidence that contradicts. So in that example I just gave you, Gaius Marius was quite adept at putting his political and military rivals to death. The Duke of Wellington never put a political or military rival to death. So the morality of the two men were quite different. So how do you deal with that in an essay? Well, in a historical essay, if I'm writing a piece and I want to be honest and as factual as possible, I explain my ideas, but I also have to acknowledge in the body of the essay where there's contradictory evidence and how they might be different. I cannot make a seamless 100% case. A good historian will present you with an evidence, present you with their theories, their ideas and all that, but they will acknowledge the limitations of their theories, where contradictory evidence comes in, and they ask you, the reader, to make up your mind whether you think the evidence they're presenting and what they think is true is correct, or will the reader give credence to perhaps the contradictory view. Now, you don't have to do that in script writing. In script writing, you're told the principle that everything's got to serve the story, and you don't have any kind of extraneous thing. You don't mention something in the script that will never come into play. You don't mention anything that cuts across the narrative. The narrative's got to go in one direction. It's got to, from the beginning to the end, it's got to have a trajectory, and you let as little as possible get in the way of that trajectory. Now, applying that to real life, let's say you are asked to recount all the events of your day. If you're a historian, you would go back, you perhaps look at a diary, you perhaps look at your phone call history, you would remember where you were. You might even ask people that you met during the day, where did we go, where did we meet? And you would present the history of your day as a kind of academic exercise, and you would perhaps not leave bits out. So let's imagine you're having a tense time at home. You're dealing with a serious issue, you're full of anguish and nervousness. Will you get fired from your job? Will she go out on a date with you? What will people like what you do? And then suddenly the doorbell rings, and it's a delivery man. And the delivery man says, "Here's a package. It's full next door, but they're not in, can you look after the package? Now, if you're a historian and you were telling the history of your day, you might include that bit. In fact, you would say, I was racked with anguish and fear and worry and all that. And then the doorbell rang. There was somebody delivering a parcel. It was for next door, and I had to look after it. Now, if you were the Hollywood scriptwriter, or any kind of scriptwriter really, you'd get rid of that because it doesn't serve the purpose. The purpose of your story is to tell your day of anguish and the tense decisions you've got to make. And the incident with the delivery man does not serve the overall narrative. It's just something that comes in from left field and ends, and it bears no relevance to the rest of the story. So you discard it, and that's the narrative. And when journalists start describing news events as narratives, that's what they're doing. They're not acting as the historians, they're not acting as the chroniclers of the day of what really happened. What they're doing is they're telling you a story that kind of makes sense and discards all the inconvenient bits that might contradict it or might get in the way of that. And let me give you some examples here. So this happened particularly with Brexit, and it happened particularly with the election of Donald Trump, and it's happening, you hear it, the narrative of Windrush, the narrative of the Grenfell Tower disaster. And these are all kind of news stories that are presented without conflicting information to give you a narrative. And here's another example with the possibility that the Russians meddled in various elections in Britain and the USA. So you might think, well, I'm savvy. I can go to other news sources and get a more rounded picture. But there's a kind of insidious effect of relying on narrative journalism. And it's this. So going back to Brexit, during the campaign, a lot was made of the Brexit bus. It was the bus that had written on the side, you could save, I think it was £350 million a year if we went in the EU and we could spend that on the NHS. The words on the bus meant roughly that. Now, in reality, when people who voted to leave the European Union were polled by the pollsters, by the in the analysis, final analysis, the NHS, the Brexit bus with the NHS claim was very low down. In fact, the whole NHS, extra money for the NHS was very low down on the list of reasons why people voted to leave the European Union. There was about, I think, more than 5 or possibly even 8 reasons that were above that, and some of them were way above that in terms of the polling data. And that's data, that's hard data that if you had your historian hat on, if you had your objective and analytical hat on, you would take that information on board and say, look, you might think the Brexit bus was crucial and instrumental, but in reality, if we look at the evidence, not so much. So the narrative, though, gets repeated that it was the bus that people were fooled by the bus. The bus contained a lie, and that lie got into people's heads, and that influenced the election, and it's caused all this woe and disaster that follows. And this is very worrying because once people started saying that was the narrative, they started saying then people are easily deluded. They're not capable of processing information. And so now the Brexit voters are stupid, they're deluded, they're gullible. That's why we have to have a rerun election. See how the narrative is working? And then finally, today on BBC Radio 4's Today programme, they actually had the debate on the voting franchise. Perhaps it's time to restrict the voting franchise, so that people who are better educated will get more of a vote than people who are less educated. This is insidious. This is where narrative narrative journalism leads you down this path, because the way that our voting franchise works is that it's not just about young, educated people, because the whole thing is that the educated people go into university and shelter them off for 3 to 5 years doing a degree are balanced out by people who have worked in the real world, have got their hands dirty, have worked the mucky jobs. It's the balance, isn't it? It's the balance between young voters and old voters. It's the balance between educated voters and uneducated voters. It's the balance between people who have been born and raised in this country and people who become naturalised citizens. It all balances out. So you have a collective will, as it were, that emerges in elections, and individuals making up their own minds. And this narrative idea is being used to give people the impression maybe it's time to change our voting franchise. Maybe it's time to wind the clock back to 1832, when the voting franchise was massively expanded and we got rid of the rotten boroughs and we had a one person, one vote voting system, which was again expanded in 1918. This is why I never believe anybody who says on the news the narrative of this story. Don't trust them. They are a charlatan. Okay, and I don't care what their reputation is. Anybody who uses narratives, who says narrative in terms of the news, is not to be trusted. Okay, time to check on that cat and see if that towel's dry. Okay, until next time, bye-bye.